Hi everybody. Today I'm going to show you how to make focaccia bread. And if you don't know what focaccia bread is, you soon will. So it's an Italian bread. The dough has a lot of olive oil in it, which makes it really flavorful and rich, but it's kind of thinner, but really spongy. And so we'll go through the steps of that, okay? So I kind of got started and then I decided I would film this for you. But what I have in here is 1 3/4 cup of warm water. So you don't want the water too cold or the yeast are dormant and then you don't activate, and you don't want the water too hot or you'll kill the yeast. So just warm water, like nice lukewarm water. So I have 1 3/4 cup in there. Use your liquid measuring cup, right? Always to measure. And then I sprinkled 1 packet of yeast on top and 1 tablespoon of sugar. And the reason we're gonna do the sugar first with this is to help the yeast activate. So the yeast are these little microorganisms, and they're going to eat the sugar and they're going to start to do their thing, which if you give them enough time, they eventually burp out CO2 and they make bubbles, and they also excrete, or you could say poop out ethanol, and they make alcohol, and that's what makes bread kind of have its flavor and beer have its flavor, but also gives the rise or the bubbles. So that's what we have in there. Now, it's been about 10-15 minutes, and so it's nice and foamy on the top, and that's what we want, okay? So once you get that, then you can add a tablespoon of kosher salt. Oh, it was a tablespoon of sugar, okay? Tablespoon of kosher salt, and you sprinkle that in. And what salt does is it doesn't kill the yeast, but it slows it down. So the sugar kind of get the yeast really excited and kind of jumpstart them. And then the salt kind of tames the yeast and settles them down so they don't overproduce, or you're gonna have a bread that's just like way too full and risen. And then we're adding 1/2 cup of olive oil, right? Liquid measuring cup, you guys, and especially with the spout, right? So anytime it's a liquid, you wanna pour it. Also, obviously with baby in tow, because he was being a little fussy. So gotta watch out for those little feet. So pour in the olive oil like this, and it's going to be separated because oil and water don't mix, right? But as we add the flour, everything's going to bind together. So what you want to use is a dough hook. If you didn't have a dough hook, what you would, like in a KitchenAid like this, what you would do is, where's the dough hook? Sorry, that bit. There it is. Okay, so this is the dough hook. So what you could do instead is you could just do this in a just a bowl with a spoon, like a wooden spoon, and just stir it until you can't anymore, and then you would just knead it. I'm kind of cheating, I'm just gonna use the dough hook, okay? So what you do is you start to add the flour. So this recipe says to add 5 cups of flour. Now, right now I'm in Nevada, it's really dry here. So we might not need as much flour, but if you go somewhere super humid, you might need more flour because of humidity in the air. Plus, maybe you're not as accurate of a measure or whatever reason, you always want to have a range when you're making breads. You don't just automatically add 5 cups and call it a day, okay? Start slowly. You're gonna add like 2 cups and then another 2 cups, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I have my, I had my mise en place already, and then I must have, oh, look at, I said it right here, 1 cup. And here's my flour. So you can just use all-purpose flour. That's completely fine. All right, so we're going to measure out a cup-ish, right? Because this is bread, we can kind of be a little more flexible with our measuring. If it's something super precise like cookies or cake, obviously you need to use the exact correct measure and the scoop, the sweet method, not the pour and the tap and guesstimate method, okay? So we'll start with 2 cups. I'm going to put this in and kind of let it go, all right? And then from here, we're going to wait till it starts to mix up a little bit. I'm gonna add another cup. Now I know it's probably gonna be right around 5 cups, but the thing is if you add too much flour into your focaccia bread, it's gonna be too dense, okay? And if you don't add enough, you can always add more, right? But you can't like unadd flour. Once it's in there, it's in there. You can't undo it. So we're gonna get this going. And what you're looking for is for everything to come into a ball. So if you were doing this by hand with this spoon, it'd be pretty messy and kind of like an oatmeal batter when it's wet, and then the more you add into it, the stickier it gets, and it becomes a dough ball, and it should pull away from the sides and should be easy to work with, and that's what we're aiming for, okay? So, another cup-ish, right? So we can add that in there. Right? And now it's starting to get a little bit harder to incorporate all that flour, so we're just gonna let it work for a little bit. So I don't think a lot of you got to do bread baking with me this year. So in bread, a key component is flour, and in flour is gluten, and you hear a lot about gluten, but what it is a protein, and it activates when wet. And so gluten, when we add the water to the flour, we start to work it, it starts to get stronger and stronger. So you can think of it kind of like your muscle. If you don't do anything to your muscles, they're really soft, right? If you don't work out, you're gonna have soft muscles. If you don't do anything to the gluten, it's gonna be soft. That's really good for making something like cookies or a cake, where you don't want the gluten developed, but it's not good if we're making something like bread. So when we want bread, we really want to develop that gluten to give it that like bread toughness that is characteristic of bread, especially like focaccia, sourdough, think of something like that, right? Really light, squishy breads are a little bit different than those breads that have some substance to them. So we really want to work to develop the gluten. So you want to work it. And the way you work it is by kneading it, which the machine's doing for me. Now, with the KitchenAid like this, with a machine, you actually can overwork something and over knead it. It's pretty impossible to over knead something by hand. So if you guys are at home and you're doing this, don't worry about over kneading if you're doing it by hand, right? It would just be if you were doing a machine, you want to make sure you don't like just turn it on and walk away, okay? So my dough is still really wet, so I'm adding that 1/5 cup of flour. And I'm going to let this mix in and see how it is, okay? So again, what we're looking for should be easy to handle. It shouldn't stick to you. It should pull away from the sides as it's mixing. So we have it mixing here. And I think what I'll do is I'll actually show you how to knead, since that's probably what y'all will be doing at home. All right, so we're going to turn this off. And I can see from here my dough is a little sticky, so I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I touch the dough, look how much flour is on my hand, right? So that's too sticky of a dough. And that was 5 cups. So I'm going to add 1/2 cup more to give it a little bit more, right? And this is exactly what you were doing if you were mixing with a spoon or something. It's just a little bit harder because, like, obviously this is a lot easier. It's not on my hands. If it's really hard for you to do it with a spoon, you can do it with your hands. You just want to try to not get too much stuff on your hands, and then you like kind of lose some of the dough, right? The other thing, always wash your hands before you start cooking. You guys should know that, but it's super important right now, especially, all right? Okay, so now it's starting to pull away from the edges a little bit. It's still wet. So what that wetness means is, see how it's still kind of sticky like that? Right, so we don't want it to be so sticky. You want it to work a little bit better. So I'm gonna add another 1/2 cup of flour. Okay, so I think the first 1/2 cup might have been more like 1/3, but okay. It wants to help, obviously. Okay, this is looking a lot better. So I'm going to turn this off, and I want to show you kind of what I'm looking for. So it's still a little sticky up top. but we're gonna work this together and you guys will be able to see what I mean. So, okay, so I have this dough. It's really soft. If you add too much flour, you'll tell. It's like, this will be dense and hard and it'll be hard to work with. So that's why it's important to just make sure you're not over adding flour. Okay, because you just, again, you can't take flour away after it's in there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this out onto a clean surface. So my countertop's clean, right? And I have a little bit of flour in the bowl that I'm gonna sprinkle down to help make sure it doesn't get stuck. And then I'll get this thing out of the way for you guys so you can see what I'm doing. Wash your hands as you go, right? And we can move this big KitchenAid. So you wouldn't want to use like a hand mixer with the wire beaters. That's fine for cookies and cakes and stuff, but really it's better to, not for bread, right? This is, you need to do it by hand. So when you're kneading, you want to use the palm, like this butt part of your hands, not your fingers. Your fingers are really oily and they don't have enough force, right? So you want to use this part, I call it the butt of your hand, and you push and then you fold and then you rotate and push and fold. And what this is doing is it's mixing everything to be nice and smooth and even. And it's also developing the gluten, right? And that's gonna give our bread its nice consistency. So what you can do is grab some flour from your counter to, if it's a little too sticky, right? Like it feels pretty good for me. It sticks to my hand a little bit, so I'm just using a little bit of flour, but not that much, because again, I don't want to overwork the dough. So keep mixing. You can use both hands. Some people kind of end up pushing more with one hand than the other, like I'm doing right now. Gather up some of that flour, keep it from sticking to you, and just keep working the dough until you can effectively do the spring test. And so what the spring test is you take your dough and you poke it and it should spring back. And that means that the gluten is developed enough for it to go ahead and get proofed. So keep working it. This feels a little sticky for me still. So I'm actually just gonna take a little bit of flour and sprinkle it down so that I can pick it up as I'm kneading. All right, now keep turning. And this is, you know, you gotta put some oomph in it. This is not kneading. You can't just pretend touch your dough. You actually have to work it. So you have to put a lot of elbow grease into there, right? Turn it with your hands. You could do this all on the machine. I just wanted to show you the process of kneading, right? So you turn it, push, fold, making sure you go all the directions, scooping up more flour as needed, okay? And it should feel pretty nice. And the more you knead it, you should smooth out all those lumps too. Beckett's like not thrilled. Okay, so keep kneading. And then you can kind of form it into a ball and perform the spring test. So I poked it, it's filling in. Okay, it's like filling in better right there. So, but not amazing, a little bit more. So sprinkles, I want a little bit more flour. Push, pull, push with the palm of your hand and pull, push, pull. Keep going. It can take up to 10 minutes. I'm not gonna knead for 10 minutes because I did a lot of pre-kneading in the mixer. But for you guys at home, if you're doing this by hand, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how effective you are at the kneading process, okay? Push, pull, push, pull. It's feeling pretty good, nice and smooth and round. Push. So you see how it's filling in? That's the spring test. I hope you can see that. Push, fill in, push, fill in. I'm gonna do just another couple passes to kind of smooth it out, and then I think it should be good, okay? And again, don't worry if you're doing this by hand, it's so hard to over knead, so don't worry about that. What we're going to do is we're going to let it proof. And so proofing is a process of letting the gluten relax, the yeast are gonna do their job and create rise. And that's going to help develop the height and the structure of the bread, okay? Now, overproofing is a thing. And so letting it sit for too long, you can actually overdevelop. The yeast are gonna do too much, it's gonna relax too much, and your bread's not gonna be so good. So you want it to double in size. Basically, it usually takes about an hour in a nice warm environment. If your house is really cold, you could put it maybe on top of like a warm area, like the dryer or something like that. Some people have been known to like turn on the oven, let the oven heat up to like 100 degrees, then you could stick it in there. But you just want it to be warm so it can activate, right? So the yeast can do their thing. If it's too cold, the yeast are gonna be a little bit more sluggish. So here we are again, press, springs back real nicely. Okay, so that's done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drizzle just a teeny bit of oil in a bowl. Take this dough ball, kind of put it around in the bowl, make sure it's nice and covered, cover it with a towel and set it aside. And then I'll see you guys back in about an hour when it doubles in size. So if this is the size now, like maybe a small cantaloupe. Oh look, I have a cantaloupe here, right? So doubled in size. So you want it to get pretty big. It'll be nice and soft, and then we'll go from there. All right. Second part of focaccia, my dough has risen, it's doubled in size, and so that's about good. So what you wanna do is just turn your dough out. So you can just take it out. It should be really nice and soft, and it feels so good. Some recipes will say punch down the dough. You don't really need to punch down this dough. Olive oil, the other half cup, you take the olive oil and you put it in your pan, your sheet pan. You kind of need a pan like this. You could do it in like a cake pan and just have it of a funky size. And it seems like a lot of oil, and that's because it is, but focaccia is a really oily, crusty bread, and so this is exactly what you want, okay? And then what you do is you take your dough and you can stretch it a little bit first, but you're just going to press it into the pan. So you just kind of start to take it and press it around your pan. And you want these finger dots. So if you see here how there's little holes for my fingers, that's okay. That's exactly what you want in your dough. That's kind of part of the focaccia. It creates these little air pockets and gives it its kind of crustiness. And then once you kind of have to work it a little bit because gluten, it stretches and shrinks. So see, as I stretch it, it shrinks back. So it's be slow, be patient, kind of work it out. And then what you're going to do is once you've finished, you'll tap your fingers and make little holes everywhere all the way down. You wanna make sure you puncture, not necessarily through, but you want the holes to reach the bottom, okay? Then you can take a little bit of oil from the pan and you can kind of place it over it. It's gonna give it a nice sheen and make like a crust. And then the last thing you can do is top it with herbs, salt, pepper, whatever you want. So a nice coarse kosher salt's really good on the top of this. That's what I'll do. I'm also going to make a design. So you can take bell peppers and olives and cherry tomatoes and whatnot and create pretty toppings, or just a little bit of rosemary would be really nice on here. Or you can just do salt and oil because salt and oil is delicious, okay? So pretty easy in terms of bread. You only need that one first proof. And then you just be patient and kind of keep stretching this to make sure it gets into all the sides, right? Like this, okay? Yeah, make sure it's not too thin in spots. This feels pretty good. So we wanna keep it like that. I'm gonna sprinkle it with salt and decorate it, and then you bake it. And it takes about half an hour to bake. So really it's a quite easy dough. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and yeah. Okay, so here is what I have so far. I used some bell peppers and I used chives and oregano, some rosemary and parsley. And then I used some pepper rings, capers, olives, tomatoes. If you use tomatoes, make sure you dry them out first because you don't want your focaccia to get super soggy. Yeah, and you can kind of create your own little masterpiece. Or you could just, I would take if I weren't doing this, I would take rosemary and sprinkle it around. Make sure you have enough olive oil around, and then sprinkle some sea salt as well. Then you bake it in about a 400 to 425 degree oven for 20 to 30 minutes. This should be nice and golden when you're finished. So next up will be the finished product. Okay, and here it is out of the oven. Looks pretty nice and toasty. So this is how it should look, nice and golden brown. If you use herbs, of course, they're gonna get a little crunchy, but that's expected. So there, yeah. All right.